Good evening. My name is Adam Saul. I'm a professor here at Victoria College and the launch director of Victoria University's Center for Creativity. The center is a new initiative, just not quite 2 years old now, whose mandate is to explore and advance creativity across disciplines. We host programs and events, support student projects, and invite artists, thinkers, and developers from different fields to share work, compare ideas, and collaborate. One of the big developments this year is the new partnership with the Toronto International Festival of Authors, which brings together two institutions who have a deep commitment to the written word, to storytelling, and to thoughtful discussion on crucial topics. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Marc Spooner and Nahlah Ayed, who are going to really manage the rest of the evening. But before I do that, as the host of the space and the person representing its current caretakers, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work here, especially now with the season turning. 2026 is already gearing up to be an incredibly exciting year for TIFA as we continue to bring authors to audiences year-round. This is only possible through the support from the board, donors, and sponsors. These include TIFA's seasoned supporter, the Weston Foundations, Beth Nowers and Jack Curtin, presenting donors of TIFA Presents this series, as well as TIFA's Global Authors Club. TIFA would also like me to acknowledge their public funders, the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of Ontario, the Ontario Arts Council, Ontario Cultural Attractions Fund, the Work in Culture Catalyst and Transformation Fund, the Toronto Arts Council, and to all TIFA's generous donors and supporters who believe that great literature is worth investing in. All right, I have two more introductions and then I will get out of the way. First is Dr. Marc Spooner. Marc is a full professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina and researches academic freedom and the effects of neoliberalism and corporatization on higher education. He's the co-editor of the award-winning book Dissident Knowledge in Higher Education from University of Regina Press, and is also one of the editors of Knowledge Under Siege, which you're going to hear about tonight. He's going to come out in a minute and say a few things about the book to start us off. And then he's going to turn things over to our moderator, Nahlah Ayed, who you probably already know is an award-winning journalist. She has worked for the CBC for more than 20 years and is currently the host of IDEAS on CBC One. I know that was a lot. Thanks for your patience. Welcome again. You're in for a very stimulating conversation. Okay.
Well, thanks a lot, Adam. Thanks to the Toronto International Festival of Authors, to the CBC and Nahlah Ayed, to the U of R Press, all the contributors to the book, and the panelists tonight. Thank you. Knowledge is indeed under siege. In the last 3 months, PEN America released a report entitled Expanding the Web of Control, America's Censored Campuses 2025. In that report, they had key findings that noted government censorship of free speech and academic freedom has reached unprecedented heights on U.S. campuses as lawmakers extend a web of political and ideological control over the sector. More than half of U.S. college and university students now study in a state with at least one law or policy restricting what can be taught or how campuses can operate. The Trump administration has weaponized multiple levers of state power to coerce colleges and universities into compliance with its ideological diktats. Another report, Scholars at Risk, Free to Think 2025, notes from January 2025, the federal government initiated an unprecedented range of actions aimed at controlling university admissions, hiring, research, teaching, departmental structures, policies on speech, disciplinary policies, internal sanctions, and finances. These actions included extra-legal executive orders targeting individual universities by revoking their funding, a series of attempts to arrest, detain, and attempt to deport without due legal process U.S.-based non-citizen scholars and students, and executive, legislative, and other actions aimed at eliminating research, programming, and academic supports related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender, environment, and many other areas. Such actions were part of a broader campaign by the US government paralleling similar actions in authoritarian countries to weaken the democratic pillars of civil society. And yet a third report just came out on the 17th of March, Academic Freedom Index. It's a report that measures academic freedom. Academic freedom has declined more quickly in the US than in any other country in the past year, and it is a significant contributor to a worrying global trend of continuing decline in academic freedom. And this is not just Trump. Many of the bans on equity, diversity, and inclusion, on gender studies, on critical race theory, post-colonial studies, cultural studies, area studies, were well underway at the state level prior to Trump's election. So although he is certainly a lightning rod, the foundation for these attacks are present and well supported at the state level. Here are some recent headlines to cheer you up. In statistics reach crisis point, nations struggle with critical lack of data, Nature warns. The US national system is approaching a crisis point because of political interference and funding cuts that are threatening long-established data sets. The organization Science observes, US government has lost more than 10,000 STEM PhDs since Trump took office. The New York Times reports professors are changing what they teach and research everywhere. They note, professors are changing what they teach, even far away from Trump's gaze. Harvard is White House's biggest target, but professors all over the country have been censoring themselves and avoiding provocative topics and rewriting grants. That's just a snapshot. And let me say, Canada is not immune. The politicized assault on higher education is spreading, and Canada is not immune. During the federal election campaign, the Conservatives pledged to defund university research it deemed as woke and thereby ideologically unacceptable. The Alberta provincial government's Bill 18, or the Provincial Priorities Act, attempts to position the Alberta government as a gatekeeper to federal research funding. The University of Alberta dismantled its Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office, aligning more with United Conservative Party official policy opposing such efforts, and more recently, going a step further, all of Alberta post-secondary education will no longer be considering equity, diversity, and inclusion factors in their hiring procedures, and more importantly, in their mission statements. The U of A changes are in line with last year's Mintz report, which called for institutional neutrality and the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Across Canada, the post-secondary sector faces chronic underfunding and is at such a breaking point that Higher Education Strategy Associates has started a retrenchment watch. Retrenchment Watch monitors institutional cutbacks in post-secondary education with a focus on Canada and the Anglosphere. As public funding declines, the sector faces a patchwork of institution-driven cuts with significant implications. Ken Steele on his dashboard notes no less than 1,135 programs have been suspended across Canada. Another main factor besides outright attacks on universities, Trump style, is the more prevalent, less controversial, but arguably no less effective repurposing or restructuring of universities and their missions through economic levers. Economic restructuring by explicitly linking performance-based funding to the labor market and industry. Everyone agrees Canada's post-secondary education is facing a chronic underfunding. Program cuts, layoffs, campus closures are making headlines across the country. The proximate cause, last year's federal government cap on international student visas, but the ultimate one, and one that we've been sounding the alarm bells about for decades, is the deliberate and chronic underfunding of public colleges and universities. When students are forced to graduate with a mortgage on their house of knowledge, what we have is an intergenerational theft of opportunity. At a time when democratic norms are fraying, these developments should ring alarm bells for anyone who believes in a robust and pluralistic democracy. I think Astrid Taylor said it best in her comments about our book. Around the world, universities are key battlegrounds in the fight against fascism. But as the contributors to this volume understand, we have to do more than aspire for a restoration of the previous broken academic status quo. This expansive and insightful collection, thanks Astra, helps clarify the stakes of the current crisis and its antecedents, while also exploring possible solutions and more life and learning affirming futures. In an op-ed, Joel Westheimer, another contributor to the collection, and I wrote, we noted, these attacks are part of a larger authoritarian playbook, undermine public trust in institutions that question power, and reward those that remain loyal. The goal is not to control universities, but to reshape the civic imagination, to erode the idea that higher education should nurture questioning, complexity, and dissent. Universities are more than job training institutions. In healthy democracies, they are engines of democratic life, and they are essential not only in their own right, but also for sustaining the other democratic pillars we so often name as central to democracy: the press, the judiciary, and the legislature. In the introduction to our book, James and I write, one argument we wish to make explicit here is that universities operating in liberal democracies have a special role to play, one that sets them apart from universities in totalitarian regimes and authoritarian and illiberal states. In addition to seeking truth, making discoveries, and passing on knowledge and wisdom, the university in a democracy has as its unique purpose that of asking difficult questions of governments, difficult questions of other power structures, and of society itself. Its role includes ensuring that public policy is informed by the best available evidence, as well as helping to foster critical and creative citizens whose formation prepares them for a lifetime of meaningful employment, community engagement, and democratic participation. When a society and a university are operating in an optimal fashion, these processes are happening both inside and outside a campus. After all, the university is in service of our current society, but also, and more importantly, the aspirational one on the horizon. What we are seeing in the USA, that universities are being reoriented and reshaped to serve an authoritarian state rather than a democratic one, is an ongoing source of tension and struggle, from the Red Scares of the early 1900s to the 1950s McCarthy era to our current present. As a final thought, I wish to end by strongly making the case that universities in a democracy are more lighthouse than ivory tower. I turn the floor to Nahlah and the panel as I greatly look forward to your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. Very sobering words, and thank you for making this happen. Without Marc, this whole event wouldn't be on, so thank you very much, Marc. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. As you know, this is a conversation that we're recording for our show, for IDEAS. If you're not familiar with IDEAS, we like to describe it as a place for people who like to think. There's a QR code floating around, probably on the screen at some stage. If you would like to follow us, you can do that. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Malinda S. Smith is an Associate Vice President, Research, and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. She is the co-editor of Nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, Teaching, Learning, and Researching While Black. Randy Boyagoda is a novelist and professor of English at the University of Toronto, where he also serves as the university's advisor on Civil Discourse, the first position of its kind in Canada. And last but not least, Davide Panagia is professor and chair of political science at UCLA, where his work bridges philosophy, media, and democratic life. Before that, he held the Canada Research Chair in Cultural Studies at Trent University. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
There is so much that we need to cover in a very short period, but I'd like to begin with a very general question to all of you. And Malinda, maybe if we could start with you. Very briefly, how would you describe the mood on university campuses right now?
Very briefly, so thanks for that question. I think it's more complex than people might imagine. So first, let me say, universities, I think, are spaces of the imagination, of creativity, of discovery. and that still is true. But universities are increasingly described as polarized places, and that's shaped by questions of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, but before that, anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, as well as sexual and gender-based violence. I would say that that gets the most attention, but the data, if we go by data, does not suggest that that's actually what preoccupies students. I think food insecurity preoccupies students. About 16% of students face food insecurity. Secondly, I would say housing precarity impacts students. And also, and behind that, there's a question of financial issues. And those are shaped by provincial funding and also by federal to some extent, but more primarily by provincial. And by saying that, I'm also saying that many of the issues facing students today are not internal to the university, they are external to the university, because universities are microcosm of the larger society. So we tend to focus as if they are all internally generated, but I want to say no. The final point I would say is the issue that's shaping the climate or the environment on campus is that all these crises, economic, housing precarity, food insecurity, the questions of whether you have jobs because of artificial intelligence, also leads to mental health issues. So students also face social anxiety and depression. And so all of these things together, I think you can call a polycrisis, and universities a microcosm of the larger society.
Reflecting the larger polycrisis. Randy, how would you describe the mood on university campuses?
I think there would probably be multiple moods, Nahlah. I think just right now, elsewhere on the campus of beautiful Victoria College, there's a whole group of first-year students celebrating the end of a first-year seminar program that they've all been part of, Vic 1. And I imagine the mood in that room is ebullient. They've had this transformative experience on campus that hopefully stays with them for the next 3 years and maybe beyond that. If you're a student who's graduating, maybe you feel more uncertain. Maybe you're not sure what comes next. You're weighing the costs of time and perhaps student debt, and facing an uncertain job market, facing the various kinds of precarity that Melinda just mentioned. And so maybe there's a little bit of uncertainty for someone like that. I think when you think about university administration, university professors, I think there would be anxiety. Anxiety about how long more this thing can keep going, writ large. I think we are facing a variety of inflection points that relate to the concept of polycrisis. Fundamentally, what is a university for? What is the public good? What is the professional good? What is the personal good that a university makes possible? And it seems to me that in good ways, whether it's in the United States or in Canada, for decades, these have been questions largely taken for granted by a large majority of people. And I don't think these questions are being taken for granted so straightforwardly anymore, whether you're a professor, a staff member, a university leader, or a student.
And I can say that's exactly why we're here tonight. Thank you. Very well, succinct statement. Thank you for that. Davide, in your world, what is it like on university campuses?
I would say that many of the things that that were said already are very much a part of it. Some of them are perfectly natural. So, students are excited in their first year and anxious in their final years precisely because all of a sudden adulting kicks in and big choices have to be made. Those things don't change. Unfortunately, because of what's happened in the United States and certainly the role or the target that my institution has been put under, I would say that among students and faculty and administration, fear is a reality. And it's not just a fear of what comes next, it's a physical fear. We have regular emails indicating or instructing us how to behave if ICE officials break into the classroom with what are they called? Warrants to deport students. We're regularly being informed that the university is under investigation by the Department of Justice. And, you know, I teach in a world, and this is something that is not insignificant, I teach in a world where there is the Second Amendment. And it's a public university and it's open. And so the real fear of, you know, somebody coming and gunning you down because somebody has posted a lecture of yours that they didn't like what you had to say on a network that is you know, not amenable to your teaching. So I mean, with all of the other things, we are very much, I think, living in fear. There is a kind of sense of, you know, keep the ship going, but it is very much a question of like day by day.
Day by day.
Yeah.
This idea that Marc really clearly outlined of universities being under attack isn't really new. I think we all can say that, all of us who have been around universities. But there is something different about it in this moment. And so, Randy, coming back to you, what is different about this moment?
I think it would be the variety of kinds of attacks. It's not only or straightforwardly a political attack. There is, and especially in the United States, the extreme costs associated with attending especially selective universities, the debt that gets generated there. In Canada, I think there is the ongoing question of the dramatic difference between, let's say, domestic and international student tuition, and the question of how our system, because of its chronic underfunding, in many ways depends on international students who aren't coming in the same way. So it goes back to the concept of the poly crisis. But I would say, actually, another term that I'd want to introduce here would be the concept of quantum politics.
Quantum politics.
Yeah, I want to think about quantum politics, and I'm mindful I'm doing it with a couple of political scientists as an English professor, but that's the beauty of being an English professor. You can just keep on talking, and as long as it sounds good, people agree with you. But this concept of quantum politics as compared to Newtonian, quantum physics as compared to Newtonian physics. Mm-hmm. Things are no longer reliable. Things are no longer stable. Quantum politics, as with quantum physics, suggests indeterminacy, uncertainty.
Unpredictability.
Unpredictability. And I would say that is what feels especially distinct right now. This isn't canon wars. This isn't PC wars. This isn't even simply woke wars. I think there's so many things going on that are sources of uncertainty, of indeterminacy, that we seem to have entered something of a kind of a quantum campus politics moment.
Malinda, would you agree? Is that what you would go to first?
Slightly different.
Okay, what's different?
One is, so I do think this moment is different to the extent that historically, universities weren't spaces of inclusion. They weren't spaces, they were designed without many of us in mind. And so it's only relatively recent in our histories where we've been talking about how do we make our universities more fair, more equitable, more inclusive? How do we bring in more diversity both in our student body, but also our professoriate and also our university leadership? These are relatively new questions, and yet part of Marc's discussion was they are now under scrutiny. There's an abnormalization of social justice, and in fact, efforts to be more inclusive are deemed reverse discrimination. So this is not only an attack on the pursuit of equity or equality and social justice, it is an attack, I think, on democratic rights, our charter, our human rights codes, and those kinds of things. I think that's profoundly different. I also think it has implications for academic freedom and free inquiry. How can you be in a university if actors external to the university are telling you what you can read, or books are banned, what you can write, what kind of research you can pursue, what kind of federal funds you can apply for? This is quite different in the Canadian environment, and I do think we need to take it seriously because our democracy, the robustness of it, is at stake, but also our sense of citizenship and belonging. So, I mean, all of those good things about what a university is and what it should do think pertains, so we need to protect that. And university is a very special place where students can come and discover who they are, but also the great ideas that animate our world can unfold without external constraints.
Of course, the Canadian University is our primary focus in this conversation. However, there's a reason Davide is here.
Yes.
And the US isn't very, very far away from us. And certainly we'll talk about the spillover effect of what's going on in the States here.
Right.
But I want to ask you, Davide, just more specifically, I think we've all seen the headlines, Trump administration targeting higher education for a while, freezing grants, filing lawsuits against universities across the country, not only Harvard and Columbia, but at UCLA, where you teach. He tried to freeze research funding and get the school to pay $1 billion to restore it. And now he's suing, after that was blocked by a judge, now he's suing the university. Can you just briefly talk about or explain what you think is really behind those attacks? Because there's been a number of different reasons.
Well, I think there are a number of different reasons. There are, traditional reasons that, there's a very, very good incentive for socioeconomic power elites to not educate the population, right? And the good incentive is that it keeps them out of the general population out of positions of power, and it reduces competition. So, I mean, that's a very crude version. We've had that since the time of the universities, when they were basically glorified monasteries and only priests could go there, right? I mean, it's the same power structure, and only certain people could enter into. So there's that, I think, basic incentive. I think the other sort of fundamental incentive is this view that, I mean, we can talk about where it might come from, and I think universities are partly responsible for this, and I'm going to be very general about it, but I think this view that you don't need a university in order to generate, to be an engine for economic prosperity. There is, this to me is something that's very new. On the part of the universities, we haven't been very good to point out the fact that everything that we use, from these microphones to these lights, were the result of all of our contributions and taxes that have paid our colleagues to be able to develop them. So that, the idea that the university is a public good. The idea of a public good is a problem in the United States, because that's still, after 70 years of the Cold War, it's still considered a communist idea, and so nobody should think about a public good.
Maybe I'll just test you on this, because Marc, in his remarks, said something about this also being kind of part of an authoritarian playbook.
But that's, yes, it is 100% part of an authoritarian playbook that goes back to the question of, when you have an authoritarian system of power, you don't want to give people access to it, right? And what we know, both statistically, historically, and the data shows us, is that the best form of access is through education.
Yeah. Malinda, you wanted to add something?
I do think this idea of soft authoritarianism, and I do think that the democracy is at stake here, and the very fact that one of the greatest thinkers on this idea of on tyranny was actually recruited from the United States to University of Toronto, from Yale University, as a number of scholars, and we have launched in Canada impact awards in order to attract some of this amazing talent. What's interesting to me is many of these talents focus on research on fascism, on advancing democracy, but also on who had the experience of profound tyranny because of anti-Semitism. So it seems to me we can't be complacent in Canada about what's at stake here in protecting our institutions, but also better understanding why we need to be defending what may have stayed in the past, but our parliaments, our constitution, our charter, our human rights bodies. So yes, I think I don't think it's, I think there's homegrown stuff here too, not just
And
from
we, and we will get to that, absolutely. But I'm sort of still trying to get my head around a little bit of what's going on in the States. And we did a lot of reading in preparation for this. And some people point to the idea of McCarthyism as the closest parallel, perhaps, of what is happening in the U.S. right now. Does that comparison, how does that ring for you, Randy?
Well, I think in a generalized way, yes, that sense that there are actors, political actors, who will seize the moment to identify people deemed enemies of the state, disloyal citizens because of their un-American activities, to be very precise, to go back to the 50s for a moment, and then to kind of go after them in a sense. I think the more dangerous thing, though, to be honest, would be the more widespread, softer version of authoritarianism. So yes, there's the high-profile congressional hearings, but then there's the decision made by a professor in a liberal arts college somewhere in Missouri to take something off a syllabus.
Like what?
Let's say, I don't know, the most immediate one that comes to mind would be, let's say, The Handmaid's Tale. And it's a small decision like that. It's all those small decisions that people make. And it's not because I think they're immediately worried about their job security. It's just the potential consequences aren't worth the risk of continuing to teach something that you otherwise would have taken for granted. Why, if I could just complete the thought, it's because I think what we see, especially in the United States, I think there's a different thing, something more interesting, more ironic happening in Canada about spillover effect that I can say something about later. But a compact has been broken. From about 1950 onward, there was a sense that the US government invested billions in the research function of the university, seeing it as a good. I don't know if it would be a public good, but a good, a national good, when it came to technology, healthcare, military innovations, etc. At the same time, undergraduate education expanded dramatically. Mm-hmm. You go to university, you'll furnish your life with more ideas, with more experiences to make you a more interesting, open, thoughtful person, and you'll get a better job as a result. Mm-hmm. And so there's this compact. Students go to university for those reasons. The government invests in university for its state reasons. And I think we're at a point now in the United States where that compact feels very broken.
Mm-hmm. Davide, maybe just pick up on that. Do you see that at play kind of in the, yeah?
Yeah, there's a lot, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I think one major historical reason, and this we have to keep it in mind, is that the growth of the American university as opposed to the Canadian university, but certainly the American university in the United States in the post-war period was because the university was part of the military-industrial complex. There were three major disciplines that contributed to the Cold War: political science, economics, and physics. Right, those were all part of the, and so it was part of the project of the Cold War that this investment in the university happened, and as a result of the GI Bill, the further investment in expanding the number of students and access to university in the United States. I would sort of want to point out one fact about this is why I had my two finger up about the soft power aspect of it, that it's not that soft. I don't know how well it is known, but every single public employee of a public university in the United States, as far as I know, certainly in California, because I had to do it, has to take a loyalty oath. Wow. And that has been going on, from time immemorial.
Loyalty to? To
not inciting terrorism, not inciting communism, not inciting insurrections.
And what effect do you think that has on?
Well, it got Angela Davis fired. Like, this is exactly how my university fired Angela Davis in the 1960s, accusing her of having communist ideas, and therefore it wasn't an academic freedom problem, it was an oath violation problem. Right? So these people that are, thinking twice right? There are, I mean, there are very serious legal consequences, and this is a country that, you know, as much as we like to imagine rights and liberties as being important, it is also a country that thinks first in terms of liability and the costs of liability.
Yeah. Melinda, you've mentioned a couple of times now this idea of a spillover, of seeing what's happening at the south of the border, kind of catapulting over our own border. Again, what would you point to as kind of the starkest thing that has crossed the border at university campuses?
So I would say a few things. One is the discussions or mention about funding of research. And we see, if we pay attention to the House of Commons Science and Research Committee, you would see there is a lot of discussion about funding research, and they are again focusing on questions around equity, diversity, inclusion. They are focusing on topics around gender. They are focusing on topics around inclusion. That's very similar to what's happening in the US, but the idea of stopping this. The second thing I would say in terms of a spillover, so that, and you can always tell there's a spillover when people start using DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, rather than EDI, which is what most Canadian post-secondary institutions
What's the
use.
difference between those two?
Well, DEI emerged out of US executive orders back in the 1960s. So that's what people use. I'm going to say that in Canada, it emerges out of, or EDI emerges out of the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment. Justice Rosalie Bella reported that, really heavily based on Statistics Canada research. And there was an Employment Equity Act, Human Rights Commission, but Section 15.2 of the Canadian Charter enables ameliorative grounds to deal with disadvantage. Few people in Canada who I'm hearing talking about DEI ever ground their discussions in the fact that we have charter rights for it or human rights for it. Very different from the United States arguments for their DEI. And the arguments, I talk about the use of the woke in Canada.
The word woke.
Woke, the word woke or wokeism. For many people, they don't even know this term comes from. It was used by African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement and earlier to tell people when they're going into segregated areas to stay woke, be alert to the fact that they may end up dead. So the idea that would be appropriated, that terminology to protect people and their rights would be appropriated and now used to deny people rights is actually quite surprising. But again, it's been imported into Canada, and people are not talking about the ways in which it's actually quite chilling to be using that language or to be defaming the people who engage in civil rights. So, I do think the abnormalization of inclusion or social justice is a spillover effect in Canada. I would just use one more example, and perhaps because I'm in Alberta, where when you start going into schools and talking about removing books from the shelves, Maya Angelou, removing Margaret Atwood, maybe we aren't paying close enough attention. When did Canada start engaging in book banning? And so, or going into universities and saying, you can't teach courses on gender. We had the Royal Commission on the Status of Women for how long? And that was a joint conservative under the Mulroney government. So there was nonpartisan, yes, gender equity. Now we are saying it's a problem. So I do think we need to actually ground ourselves in Canadian history, Canadian stories, and lore, because I think the spillover effect is quite concerning.
Randy, you're allowed to. Go ahead. Feel free to react. Randy, maybe could you sort of add to that?
Sure.
In terms of what we heard from Davide about the academic chill that is sort of descending on universities, how much of that are you seeing echoes of here on this side of the border?
Well, I think, to be honest, Nahlah, I was more interested in the spillover effect. I'm wondering if I can maybe reflect on that a little bit.
Please.
So there's another way to think about the spillover effect. You mentioned it with the Impact Plus chairs, the idea that the federal government, under Prime Minister Marc Carney, is investing I think it's about $1 billion.
$1.5
$1.5 billion to recruit top researchers in priority areas associated with national purpose.
$1.7 billion.
$1.7 billion to Canadian universities. So step back for a moment. The Canadian government is making explicit investments and priorities that have a lot to do with, yes, democratic resiliency, but also national defense. And so it seems to me like the intensification of Canadian nationalism is a striking effect of what's been happening south of the border since the second Trump administration. And the idea that as the federal government continues, I suspect, to intensify its investments in national defense, well, this will necessarily create grant opportunities for Canadian researchers. And this, I think, is a very uncomfortable thing in a Canadian campus context, because I think we're really straightforward in being upset at the idea that American universities are being told to invest in dual-use technology. And yet we're doing the exact same thing here, and we're taking great patriotic pride in it. And it would be a very Canadian thing to do to not clap at what I said, but ignore what I said and continue the conversation. But I think there's something going on there that we're not reckoning with.
Melinda, one more quick note, and then we're going to talk about funding some more. Please.
Oh, sorry. I just said I don't want us to lose sight of when we say spillover effect, the impact on academic freedom.
Yeah.
And the ability to pursue. So we talk about the excitement of students coming into universities and they're wanting to pursue their areas of love and their research and their discovery and learn from each other, and the first time they're away from home, so all the excitement about that. And then you get into a university environment, and the questions you might want to ask, you can't pose. The books you might want to read, you can't read, because your syllabus is under scrutiny. So I don't want us to lose sight of the implications of that chill for our democracy, and why we need in Canada to protect academic freedom, not just in collective agreements, but in Europe they're talking about putting it into their constitutions. So this is a conversation worthy of having.
Davide, I'm curious if you could talk about or explain a very personal example of academic chill that is playing out in your own university, or your own curriculum, in fact.
Well, it's definitely the case. I mean, as chair of the department, I have, obviously certain responsibilities, as all chairs do, that have to do with the manager of the department, and so I'm a representative of the department. And so one of the sort of consequences, personal consequences, for me is that every few months I get an email from some ambiguous legal source within the university telling me that to keep, and I just got one on Sunday as I was landing in Toronto, which is a better landing than what happened in New York, so at least it's not as tragic as that. But nevertheless, it was an email saying that, all of my communications, including my private communications, including my private cell phone communication, text message, etc., are subject to investigation by the Department of Justice, and so I have to keep all of my communication, electronic communications, because they could be selected. So this is, something that creates not an insignificant amount of personal anxiety, but at the same time, it actually puts us in a very difficult position. Even this question of, the TSA agents taking cell phones and cloning cell phones and things like that, because we are also subject to federal laws that prevent us from communicating student information to anyone, right? So any sort of thing that I have to, in the case of the electronic stuff from the Department of Justice, I'm protected, but anytime I give up my cell phone, I'm actually violating a federal law at the same time. So at that personal level, all of us are constantly dealing with these kinds of very difficult legal challenges that I have to admit, when I went to grad school, they didn't prepare me for. This wasn't part of my PhD training.
Yeah.
At a personal level, I just, I have to find, ways, and well, there's certainly certain things that I won't be able, even before that becomes ever more difficult to teach. I teach a lot of films, and certain films you can't, teach and present anymore. And
There are certain courses that aren't being taught anymore.
well, there's titles are being changed of courses. renaming of courses, renaming of directives. Inclusive excellence is now the new EDI. So, people try to find workarounds. But yes, I mean, a lot of departments, gender studies department, Afro-American departments, are very much, and I'm sure everybody heard about the ridiculous case in Texas where a philosophy professor was told that he couldn't teach the Plato's Republic because it was too woke.
That's still being taught in Canada, isn't it? I do want to ask about, just follow up on that, EDI or DEI, I guess, depending on the side of the border we're on. But why are these initiatives, why have they become such a flashpoint? Maybe Malinda and then Randy?
I mean, I think EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and I think the acronymization of this work is really an issue. So these have always been about opening doors, removing barriers, creating access and opportunity for wider and wider groups of people. So we've gone from not only men in universities or only religious people in universities to now we have working class people in universities. We now have reaching out to racialized people, more women are in schools and universities, more indigenous peoples. So the idea of a big tent of opportunity for universities. This has led to pushback of reverse discrimination, anti-white, anti-men. And what surprises me about anyone listening to this is to look at the evidence. It's actually not based on evidence. And so now we can't use anti-bias. We can't use anti-bias in our workshops in Alberta, and we can't use cultural competencies, or we can't require them. And there's a whole list of words that have been banned because they are claimed to be discriminatory. So questions of justice have been turned around to be questions of injustice. So EDI was about basically making the university a more fair and inclusive place for a larger swath of the population. I think it's quite consistent with democracy. Ronald Debert talks about democracy. One of the goals of the universities is social mobility, right? So you have more people come in, and they are able then actually to span democracy, but also prosperity.
But just quickly, Malinda, you've noted in the past that there's a link between the language that Alberta universities are using or adopting and what's being used in American states such as Mississippi when we're talking about EDI, DEI. What is that link?
Yes. So the language that most of Alberta universities, I think this is now well written about, have shifted away from the language of equity, diversity, inclusion. I think one university president wrote about why that was the case, but they have adopted language. Most have adopted language around access, community, and belonging. And that was used previously in Florida and Mississippi universities as well. And other universities are misusing, I would say, the commitment with Daniels referred to as one of the purpose of universities is to have to promote and advance pluralism, including to have a diversity of ideas and perspectives and cultures, and how to get people to live well together, right? How to build that. Universities are an ideal place for that. So I think these pursuits have been misused to say they're to juxtapose them against EDI, but I actually think we need to advance both. And in the United States, I think EDI, in the province of Alberta, the new legislation is called the Jordan-Peterson legislation, which is used to say we shouldn't be able to use language like anti-bias, cultural competencies, including indigenous education, and so on. So maybe people are missing this. But I think it's important to pay attention to.
Randy, I we've talked previously about trust in university, university institutions. How does all of this debate over that language and the borrowing of these kinds of ideas from south of the border, how does that influence how university institutions are perceived and whether they are or not trusted?
Well, I think we do live in what social scientists call a low-trust environment. Certainly in my work as U of T's advisor on Civil Discourse, I hear about this, professors and students anxious about trusting each other. In department meetings, we see this play out a lot. But it does have to do with language. And I was thinking about one example that maybe speaks to one of the challenges that I think we face. As part of my U of T civil discourse work, I talked to a lot of different people about what we do well when it comes to civil discourse, what we could be doing better, et cetera. And I was in a consultation session, and someone was there on behalf of a student organization or student life-related organization, and they were discussing an election watch party they had for the US presidential election this past November for students, as an example of, you know, creating the conditions for people to come together who have difference. And as I recall, the event was trauma-informed and inclusive. And I immediately said, is that for the Trump supporters who were sad that he didn't win by a larger margin? And the person just looked at me blankly. And so then I kind of pressed it a little bit to kind of point out that inclusion codes left. Let's be straightforward about this. I think we should be inclusive spaces. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion are good things to pursue. But in the institutional landscape, they code more progressive than not. And so to my mind, where that causes a problem is, let's say you're hosting one of these election watch parties and 3 tall white guys show up wearing MAGA hats. What do we do? How does this affect the question of inclusion? Because to my mind, I would much rather those 3 students be part of a larger, diverse community and feel part of that than feel like I'm not trusted here, I'm not welcome here, this place is inclusive, just not for people like me. And I understand there's a deeper history for that, and I understand those correctives, but in the individual case, I would much rather those students are at a U of T event than going elsewhere to find community. But that results in some friction and some tension. And I think we need to, at some level, as Foucault might suggest, interrogate the terms that we use or that we sometimes take for granted. And so I think in some ways inclusion is subject to interrogation that way.
But so if I can
Please.
say, I mean, the language of social inclusion, which is being used in Europe for years to talk about how they move immigrants who couldn't be citizens into part of the national fabric. It's been used in political science. I think I'm thinking of the work of Jane Jensen going back for decades. I mean, I think she's now retired or close to it. And so social inclusion was really about how do you bring into the big tent of citizenship and belonging people who were on the margins. So I do think this is the abnormalization, again, of social justice when we say that ordinary words, which are trying to do things which every society and every democracy needs, we don't need people on the margins. We don't need people whose skills and knowledges and brilliance are underutilized. We don't need doctors and engineers driving taxi cabs. We need to be more inclusive. So now imagine into this day, that language that was so ordinary and so much a part of nation building is now turned on its head and is seen as something exclusionary.
But in fact, it's
so the language game is actually important, but I would say that's the. So let me let you finish.
No, I was going to say, I think your
Last
earlier
point on this.
example,
Go ahead.
your earlier example about the etymology of woke was an excellent example.
Yeah.
And this is what I mean by we use words now, terms that at some level we take for granted, and we take for granted a consensus around them that may not exactly exist. And so what you just described right there as inclusion makes excellent sense to me. And if that's how we lived it out on campus, that would be great. But yes. I'm just not convinced that everyone experiences it in that good way you just described.
Davide, last point on this, and then we're going to shift gears.
Right. I'll be very quick because, I mean, again, this is a spillover problem. In the United States, the question of inclusion is fundamentally tied to the history of racism and, of course, slavery. Okay? There's no ands or buts about that as far as I'm concerned. In Canada, though, I'm surprised because, and I think these are some missed opportunities because now I've been gone from Canada for 12 years now, but Canadian history hasn't changed in 12 years. And it seems to me that the constitutional crisis that defined the post-war period in Canada was fundamentally a constitutional crisis that was dealing with inclusion, right, which is the inclusion of Quebec and of French Canada. It's very strange to me hearing you say this, that isn't part of the conversation of how to respond to any challenge of inclusion, because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't exist without a constitutional crisis about equality and inclusion, and a fundamental sort of negotiation that happened with the notwithstanding clause as a satisfaction of the demand of inclusion.
But I don't know if it was named that way. I mean,
No, but let's name it that way because we shouldn't stick to.
but it's a reverse formation in order to criticize how it's being used now. is
But
my point.
conceptually, it was conceptualized that
Sure,
way.
but it wasn't freighted. The vocabulary wasn't
No,
freighted
I
for the
agree
reasons
with you.
Belinda was
I
describing.
agree with you, but you know, it's an opportunity to return to.
That I can agree with, yeah.
I want to jump on this, but we can move on.
Yeah.
That's the subject of another conversation soon. But I do want to kind of get to the heart of why we're having this conversation, and back to some of the things that not that this is an incredibly important part of it, but underlying all of that is this idea, of course, of universities being central to democratic life and supposed to reflect the society that we live in, all of us out here outside of university gates. You know, wealth disparity continues to escalate, authoritarianism continues to rise. So I want to ask you all a blunt question. Have universities failed in that central mission to be that pillar of democracy? I mean, Randy, how would you answer that?
No, I don't think they have failed. You might say they might be flailing a little bit at that effort because of a crisis of confidence, because of the broken compact, perhaps, that I was describing earlier in the US context. But I think, and I'm thinking here about the University of Toronto with its 100,000 students, I would like to think with confidence that the great majority of University of Toronto students have a transformational experience on our 3 campuses. And that means both in terms of the interior life and the relationships and the experiences they have, and the capacity to go out into the world and get a better job than if they didn't come to the University of Toronto. And I think for the decisive majority of our students, that remains the case, even though at the level of perception, at the level of fraught-feeling public discourse, the university doesn't feel like it's doing what it used to do, because, again, as I said earlier, we don't take these things for granted anymore, nor I think should we. And I think we keep on trying and we fail better, we flail better, perhaps would be the hope I would have for higher education. There's a warm way for me to end my point.
Melinda, go ahead.
I am much more optimistic about that. I actually do think the polarization and crisis narrative may be sometimes exaggerated or amplified. And I actually think universities, I would say it depends on which disciplines you are, and certainly in this kind of conversation, the social science, humanities, and creative arts are under more stress than you would say science or engineering or medicine, okay? So, and because we are the ones that get characterized as having contentious conversations, difficult conversations that require brave conversations. But I mean, okay, learning is sometimes hard. But I do think universities remain incredible places. This is an opportunity for us to talk about what is the role and responsibilities in universities in democracy. They are more complex because our societies are more complex. We have a great social transformation going on with people from all over the world, people who don't know each other, and we get back to the idea of bowling alone from Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam. That means universities, as our municipalities and our provinces, have a greater job to do with, yes, social inclusion. How do you cultivate it? It's not going to happen on its own. It actually needs cultivation. And divisive language, polarizing language, I blame the language game, the misuse of language to polarize us as part of the issue. So I don't want to exaggerate the situation on university campuses, because I still think they remain vital to social mobilization, developing citizenship and belonging, to developing pluralism, and to actually making our societies and our world better. So maybe that's maybe we need to actually also have more conversations like this in order for us to recognize the value of universities, colleges for the health and well-being, not of us only individually, but also for our democracy.
Is the answer different in the US, Davide?
Well, I think, no, it's not different in the US in the sense that it's the same coupling of basically education is good for democracy, okay? And that's fine. But the idea that a university is good for democracy, I always like to look things both conceptually and historically as well, so as to inform the sort of contemporary moment. That is very much part of a post-war discourse that invested in the university for its economic and military, universities existed before we had democracies, right? And they had the same problems. First of all, knowledge increased regardless. Fewer people got to go, but knowledge increased regardless, and so on and so forth. So there isn't a natural relationship between the university and democracies. What has developed over the years, I think, is an emphasis on the place of experimental thinking, right, as necessary to democracy when we understand democracy as a project of collective participation where we can't know what comes next.
But if there are things that are being deliberately excluded from that experience on
That's a
campuses,
huge
are
problem.
campuses living up to that ideal?
I think any form of exclusion necessarily is a limitation of that ideal and of that project. And I will say this, I won't even say this controversially because of the obvious questions around race, ethnicity, and gender, but simply because we don't know who the next smart person is and where they're going to come from. And they're going to devise that particular thing that will make it so that I can live longer, right? That is not, gender specific or race specific.
I want to just zoom out a little bit and ask any of you, what the effect is. We talk about, again, I'm being very broad here, but when we talk about the humanities in particular being absolutely fundamental to bolstering democracy, both in producing the people who practice democracy, but also, exchange of ideas, all those things that, Davide, you mentioned. But in Canada and in the US, humanities programs are being cut. What are the consequences? Malinda.
Ask the social scientist. I think the humanities, historically, from the philosophers and the poets and the great thinkers of antiquity in all regions, have been vital to society. And I actually do think we need to reflect on why there have been such profound cuts. Where do you learn critical thinking? Where do you learn to read great books and the questions they pose? So the idea of book banning, for example, should be anathema to us in this current moment. So my view is part of it, the shift, and I think one of the reasons why this Knowledge Under Siege book is so important to this conversation today is because it helps us to ground about what's happening to universities and whether they remain the places where you can have these kind of great ideas and do discovery and pursue knowledge unfettered by external constraints, political, donor, or otherwise. It invites us to ground ourselves and think, what do we want our universities to be? And do we want great universities? And so we should be having this conversation. But the humanities and the social sciences have been indispensable to this understanding. And to the extent that they shrink, I think that you also see that we shrink our capacity to support the kinds of disciplines and conversations that are vital not only to our democracies, but to our health and well-being as well.
So Randy, back to the question of whether universities are failing or not. I'm not trying to prove one or the other, but I'm curious, when it's humanities that are being cut, who's to blame? I mean, where do you place that responsibility?
No, I blame it on parents. Don't take the humanities. Why are you taking an English degree? Yes, there are clear frontal attacks, especially on certain humanities programs, and especially in places like the contemporary United States. But humanity enrollments, writ large, have been flatlining or declining for a long time under any kind of government in North America. And why is that? Because the students aren't taking the courses. And so then the question becomes, why aren't they taking the courses? I think it's probably two things. I think there is a very reasonable pressure on the part of parents that they expect if a young person's going to spend 4 years of their lives and tens of thousands of dollars learning something, there should be some utility to that. And that utility doesn't translate into the depth and shadow that you get only from reading great books and having conversations about them. It's hard to make that case, and it's understandable, especially in public universities. So I think there's that fundamental problem. And then let me go beyond that. It's not just the parents. I think we should blame the kids too, in that we were just lamenting backstage the question of who's actually reading these books on these syllabi anymore. The capacity for reading, the capacity for that patient life inside a book, inside a writing exercise, is withering, and you all know this. And so it seems to me like this is a problem that is more systemic than any political party.
Can I?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Davide, and then Malinda, and then we're going to switch again. Go ahead.
I think that, this adds on to this. I was going to immediately sort of say, well, the part of the problem is our own because we tend to think so much in terms of the instrumentalization function of anything that we do, right? It has to have an output of some kind. Thankfully, now we have computers that produce output, so we don't have to worry as much about them anymore. But I think that, there's a further problem that really, has to do, that's encompassed in this, and I can't see if there's students in the crowd, but if there are students, especially undergraduates in the crowd, you'll know this, is that the humanities and social sciences, and the humanities-oriented social sciences, like my subfield, which is political philosophy, don't give you right answers. So you can never tell a student what they have to do in order to get an A in the class, right? It's just not possible. And because the only possible answer is keep reading, keep puzzling, keep trying to figure it out, keep being reflexive, right? That produces a level of anxiety, of uncertainty in a student, right, that's very difficult. I think that one of the easiest ways to solve this problem, it'll never happen, but one of the easiest ways to solve this problem is get rid of the grades. Getting rid of the grades means getting rid of the anxiety of having to perform in order to produce an output and instrumentalize knowledge, because really what a grade is, or what a GPA is effectively the educational equivalent of money, right?
Interesting idea. Yeah.
Just quickly, I wanted to say that this idea of reading, I mean, because now I don't know how many of you listen to podcasts or audiobooks or otherwise, but reading, when you think of tech, we bring in technology and we bring up little kids, and I'll just tell you, my grandkid, his view was, I'm fiddling around with something. He's like, oh, just tell it what to do. I should tell the the remote what to do instead of trying to figure out with pushing the button. Just tell it. I'm thinking.
Does he
okay,
say that about books? Does he point at books and say, just tell them what to do?
That's what I'm trying to get at. The thing is, it actually takes work to get young people to read, to pick up a book and say, turn the page and read, because they are used to doing this. And so we have to think also then about the spaces of learning and the ways in which technology is shaping it. I'll just give you one quick example from COVID-19. For a brief moment, we can remember all the horrors of COVID. People started going to reading films. They started looking at art. I was looking at art shows in Italy, all over the place, virtually. We remembered the things that gave us joy. We remembered the things that made our lives better for a moment. We started walking on trails and doing things that we did before we had only technology. I mean, it's technology enhanced, but I think books are being impacted by technology, and I actually think that's also true of learning. And so I'll leave that to Randy, the great thinker.
Well, I'll just
Go ahead, Randy. Yeah.
I'll just say I've blamed the parents, I've blamed the kids, but I think we should also blame ourselves.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Here's my Catholic public service moment. For Lent this year, I deleted all the news apps from my phone.
Yeah. Oh, there's such stress.
Why? Because I am embarrassed as a novelist and as a professor of English that I can't read a book for more than 6 or 7 minutes before I need to refresh my New York Times app out of some self-important desire to know what's going on in the world. No, it's hard to read a book. It's hard to read a book when you're 4 and when you're 40. It's hard to read a book. And I think what we all need to do, what I'm suggesting to all of our listeners, Nahlah, delete all of your apps, except CBC.
Except CBC
delete
Ideas.
all of your apps.
It's not a
And
news
read
app.
a physical book and show others, by example, the goods of patience and concentration, and you will have a fundamentally different relationship to the world if you put the device down and pick up a book.
Okay, that's good advice. I want to do a quick round on a very final kind of tying up of what we've been talking about, and then talk about money to end off. And we're a little bit over time, so bear with us, but we need to get through this. So I want to say that our first episode on Universities on Ideas aired in 2021. We discussed the issue again in Regina in 2023. Malinda, that's where we met, and also in Windsor in 2024 with you, Randy. And so much has happened since that very first conversation. I want to know, just very briefly from each of you, how you would answer the question, given everything that we've been talking about, what is a university for?
A university is for advancing knowledge through teaching and research. Full stop.
Okay. Davide and then Malinda.
A university is a place where you learn how to learn. Full stop.
Okay. Malinda.
I'm between the full stops.
You're the bracket. You're the bracket.
Universities are spaces of the imagination where you discover who you are and what you love, but also all the things that make our world, our society and our world better, whatever discipline you are in.
Okay. Thank you for that. I want to talk a bit about money before we end off. I don't have to tell you that underfunding is a major and chronic problem for Canadian and American universities, but certainly in Canada, it's a constant problem. It correlates to rising tuition fees and the overall cost of going to university. It is also seen, as you said very early on, Randy, as a form of yet another form of attack against universities, perhaps a way to defang certain universities. What happens if a university education reverts to being something that only the very wealthy can access? So Davide, and then down the line.
You've got the American university system. You know, I've told my kids that they have to, you know, I can't afford them to send to elite American universities. It's UCLA is a public university, and in-state tuition is $15,000 a year. And that's without, that's just tuition,
Yeah.
right? Do you want a system where only those, where there are two options, either the very wealthy can afford it, or those who aren't wealthy begin their lives with an insurmountable amount of debt that is complicated by a precarious job market and no access to health care?
Malinda?
I think I want to return to the concept of polycrisis, and one of them is this kind of all of these insecurities, including around money, and they are shaped both by international and domestic factors. International, we think of just freezing international students, which will pay in double fees, and all of a sudden you now have universities in crisis. You think of funding from provincial governments, because education is primarily provincial, and you see the ways in which everything that we value in a university, including academic freedom, including what we learn, what we study, the books we read, are shaped by money. And so unless we understand education as a public good for uplifting the whole people, that was the Henry Marshall Tory's idea, that universities are spaces for uplifting everyone. And this was back in the 1900s. I think we will face ongoing crisis. We need to think of universities as places of public good and also fund them accordingly, because democracy, but also prosperity, depend on it.
I want to go back to something that Marc observed in his opening remarks, and it was that I think you're citing a New York Times reporting on the knock-on effects of attacks on the most prominent universities being felt elsewhere. You know, I think, Nahlah, I would probably reject the premise of your question at some basic level and suggest what we actually have is an ecosystem problem, where in the United States, I think by and large, the national imaginary more or less looks to a leafy New England college campus as what university is. And that's probably true for, what, 1% of students who attend university in the United States. But the whole system depends on this collective imagining of this bucolic pastoral place. In Canada, my worry would be that because of the funding pressures that we've been discussing, the expansion of higher education will be motivated to keep the system running. And so then the more prominent, the more resourced universities will depend upon this larger array of other universities and ever larger enrollments as a way to keep the system going. And I think that's really what the problem could end up being.
Okay. A little bit more about money, but a question directed at you, Davide, is...
I don't have any.
Sorry?
You would like some.
There's this amount of money, $1.7 billion, that's being used to help recruit international scholars. That's being spent by the federal government to bring, scholars here. I'm curious, as a Canadian scholar who's in the U.S., what your views are of that idea.
Well, it's even more complicated than that, because I'm a Canadian scholar who's in the U.S. who began his career benefiting from a similar program, having been a Canada Research Chair. I think that the model that we have in Canada is exceptional in terms of the federal monies investing in research and provincial monies investing in teaching and balancing these two elements of university life. I think the provinces have to step up.
But how does that, go ahead, yeah? There have been notable academics, as we mentioned, like Timothy Snyder and Marcy Chor, who are on this campus, at the University of Toronto, who have been recruited to come here. Is this a good way to spend federal money?
Yes.
Is this the right way to spend that kind of money, given the shortfalls in the system?
Yes, because there's never been a time where federal money has gone to fixing the shortfalls, the structural shortfalls in the system, right? It's never been the case that, that federal monies, as far as I understand it, has been directed towards that. That's why we have, for those who don't know, we have federal granting agencies, right? We don't have provincial granting agencies. We have federal granting agencies, right? I mean, I don't know when it happened, but at a certain point, that's the way that it happened in Canada. So yes, I mean, the federal granting agencies are the ones, and the federal government is the one that's providing research monies so that we learn about how to have new and more sophisticated forms of cardiac surgery.
Would you consider moving back to Canada under such a
Oh
program?
no, I'm actively considering it.
He gave me his CV before we came on stage.
You know of any
No,
positions?
what I could,
That's
yes.
the point. I mean, these chairs were designed to attract. I mean, one goal was to attract, including with the CRCs, to bring Canadians home,
Right.
and to have that talent contribute to Canada. But the other thing is to bring the best in the world here. But I want to give a little cautionary note, because we already have homegrown talent.
Yep.
And so the proportionality of the funds going to recruit externally needs to be well kept in balance with making sure that we are funding the social science and humanities here, scholars who are here, who are talented, so they aren't being recruited elsewhere. Maybe they won't be going to the US now,
Yeah.
but there's also, Europe is also doing the same thing. Britain is doing the same thing. So how do we make sure we keep talent, we recruit and retain talent in Canada, not just recruit them externally?
Well, in a sense, this kind of speaks to what I was saying earlier, Nahlah, about that idea that we're living in a time of quantum campus politics. It is striking to imagine 2 years ago there'd be a federal announcement of $1.7 billion to attract international talent here. It would be hard to imagine a situation like that. But I think it's very important to keep in mind, again, that they're not being brought up to as scholars of 19th century Portuguese poetry. There is national purpose.
Yeah.
There is absolutely military industrial purpose to these sorts of programs. And we don't like it if the US does it, but we're doing it very proudly and patriotically as Canadians. And I understand the argument for it. I'm for it. But I think we need to reckon with that implication that we are very much doing what we're so upset at some level that the United States has been doing in its own university system for decades.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And only one of the main themes was around democracy and community. The rest were in
AI, infrastructure, technology.
Yeah. So
And there's goods to that, but I'm just saying it's not so straightforward.
Yeah.
I would have loved to see chairs designed to around democracy at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just have two more quick questions, and then if you are thinking of asking a question, this is a good time to perhaps line up at microphones. We've got one on each side, but I am going to ask just two more very quick questions. A lot of people listening to our conversation right now have zero connection to universities. I'm just wondering, again, a short answer from each of you. Why should any of that why should any of this that we're talking about matter to them, Davide?
I mean, my answer is going to sound similar. I think everybody has a connection to the university because, in terms of research, right? Because the roads that we drive on was part of the chemical industry chemistry departments that figured out how to combine elements. You know, the elevators whose buttons we press are part of an engineering program, et cetera, et cetera. So we all actually really do have a connection. I think our job, and one of the great things about this event, is to make that known, that there is a connection that everybody has. I think, and then finally, I would say that the connection that we need to sort of encourage is to, as Malinda was saying, is to continue to communicate the idea that universities are a public good for everyone.
Randy and then Malinda, I have a specific question for you.
Oh.
That's why I'm leaving you to last. Yeah. Please, Randy, go ahead.
No, I really have nothing to add to what Davide
Okay.
just said. Everyone
All
listening
right,
to this
fine.
show
Yeah.
benefits from universities.
So, Malinda, the question I had for you is Henry Marshall Tory helped establish Canadian universities, including Carleton in Ottawa, University of British Columbia, and the University of Alberta. He said that the goal of the modern university was to uplift the whole people. This goal of kind of uplifting the whole people, what happens if we lose sight of that goal?
Imagine, I think this was in 1910 when he said this. Okay, and he wasn't saying only rural people or urban people. He wasn't saying only immigrants or non-immigrants, the whole people. I mean, that vision of a great university, I think in a city is one that actually shapes my career. I'll just tell you, I say it all the time because I think it matters. And I actually think we cannot afford to lose sight of that. And the universities, as created, were designed to be spaces where citizens of all walks of life can come and become better citizens, better people individually, not individually, but also they saw that as spaces where you can cultivate pluralism of how people of these different backgrounds can learn to get along better, to live better. There's no other institution, none in our society, than a university where this can happen, where you have such diversity of people, and where you have the possibility of creating something better. So I think Henry Marshall Torrey was onto something very wise, and I think we'd be well served in 2016 and beyond to heed those words today.
Thank you, Malinda. Thanks very much. We'll open it up to questions. We'll start here. We'll go back and forth. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ashish. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting discussion. I just have a very simple question at the risk of being called woke. Listening to the segment on DEI and inclusiveness and exclusiveness, do you believe that the words eugenics, patriarchy, misogyny, and of course McCarthyism play a role in all this?
Who are you asking the question to? Anyone in particular?
No, anyone who wants to answer
Who
it.
would like to field that?
You should start.
I get to start this one?
Yeah.
I guess
Thank you.
I'm not entirely following your logic, I must confess.
Just, yeah, maybe just reiterate what
Yeah.
exactly it is you're...
So
Yeah,
McCarthyism was communism,
right.
right? So that's one. The second is eugenics is about race, right? So I'm coming from there. Patriarchy is let's keep women out of this. And misogyny is, of course, misogyny.
Right.
Because what I'm seeing is in society in general, these are beginning to play out. Maybe more in the United States than here. Forget about other
So
countries.
you're wondering whether the term inclusion has a kind of coded meaning?
No, are these words in the background of whatever is being done?
I don't know if the words are, but certainly the sentiments associated with the words would be. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so here's what I would say to that. I mean, in a way, the anti-woke language, lexicon, there's a whole range of terms used around that. Part of it is, and I call it the abnormalization of social justice. So part of the great pull towards social inclusion, it was to say, let's mitigate or ameliorate conditions of sexism, patriarchy, misogyny. Universities were spaces where eugenics flourished. There were department doors where eugenicists were there. Psychology departments had eugenicists. So so now universities are spaces where we educate about eugenics and about the harm it did, including to indigenous populations, to racialized populations. And so in a way, if this whole pursuit of social justice becomes dismissed as wokeism, it suggests then that we shouldn't pursue these things. And so I said to people, if you're opposed to equity, you want inequities, you're opposed to inclusion, you want exclusion, you're opposed to diversity, you want to return to homogeneity, which probably wasn't a moment. So what is it precisely? So that's part of the language game that you are alluding to. Can we still talk about these kinds of things and the harm they cause and why we are trying to ameliorate those harms, including through anti-bias education? So yes, we should.
Thanks for the question and the answer. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm really struck in this conversation how Palestine and Israel haven't come up when we talk about knowledge under siege, given the funding attacks from Trump, the congressional hearings in the US. At all of your campuses, pro-Palestine expression has been come down on pretty hard. People were shot with rubber bullets at U of Calgary, at the protest there. UCLA, pretty similar. So I guess my question is the attack on sort of pro-Palestine expression and research in universities and on campuses, is that an anomaly, or is that something that we're going to see more of? Like, is that playbook going to play out again and again on other topics? Yeah, that's the question.
So is it specific to that specific situation, is what you're saying? And who are you asking it to, any in particular?
Anyone, but
Yeah?
I'm going to go specifically with the administrators, which are the left two.
Sure. So Randy.
At least we know the right to.
Davide is a department chair, so he joins us. But
Not exactly.
Thanks.
so I will say, I think what you're asking is whether the ways in which pro-Palestine demonstrations and activism were
Scholarship as
and scholarship were pressured, were put under a great deal of pressure in a lot of different ways, as you were just describing. You're asking if that's anomalous or if that's consistent with a larger pattern?
Whether that was, often talk about Palestine as a laboratory, the way that attacks on that is going to be replicated in other domains around the world, including other types of scholarship, other people.
I see. So I think it's fair to say that perhaps the most direct and clear threats to academic freedom before the re-election of President Trump would have been around academic freedom concerns associated with Palestine scholarship and advocacy, although advocacy scholarship is and academic freedom is more complex to my mind. The question I guess you're asking is whether that kind of pressure, that kind of sense of being silent, you're feeling like you can't bring these things up, will universities themselves learn from that? I don't think so, but I certainly think it has been cited, obviously publicly, by elected leaders on both sides of the border as a rationale for the universities needing to be taken under a stricter control by government, certainly. I see that.
So,
Well, a quick ad?
okay,
Please.
okay, no, that's good. I mean, I'm fine to leave it there. Or I can
Yeah.
speak, but I actually do think that this question we should attend to seriously, because in a way, the new push to neutrality declarations that universities are stating, so they're committing to be neutral, right? Not restrained. So there's the principle of neutrality and there's the principle of restraint. To be neutral so they don't speak to these kinds of things in terms of international relations, for example, or political issues, or controversial issues. The dilemma, of course, is that doesn't actually trickle down into what you get to teach, or what you can put on your course syllabi, or how you have civil discourse in your classes, or how you engage in difficult conversations. So my view is, if we are committed to academic freedom and free inquiry, as a political scientist, I want to say we need to have fulsome discussions about all of these kinds of issues, and I don't think it's the task for universities to chill the conversation. So if they're committed to not chilling the conversation as they're claiming with their neutrality principles, then that's a good thing. Can we learn from this for other kinds of issues? I sure hope so. I think we can learn from the Iranian situation, the Ukrainian situation, and actually think about coming up with better ways of doing things. And I mean, that's what the university is supposed to be, a space where you can have these kinds of difficult conversations and come up with reasonable explanations. And when they start censoring or chilling, then we get into these challenges.
Thank you for that. Please go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Benjamin. I'm a second-year international student from the US, and whenever I tell people this, I get the, "Ooh, aren't you so glad you're here? Aren't you so glad you're in Canada? Isn't that so much better?" And the first time I thought it was funny, and then it really started getting on my nerves. As I've been here for the past 2 years, I've noticed a sort of moral superiority coming from the Canadians that I interact. See, and now you're all laughing, but this is real.
Needless to say.
And it seems to me that there is a large sense of, as an outsider, it seems that there's a large sense of national identity built on, well, at least we're not them. And that kind of stinks. I feel like, especially to Davide, as a Canadian person living in the United States, just from living there for, you said 12 years, but perhaps in the first 2 years of living there, you probably learned a lot more about American politics through osmosis than I have learned through osmosis just living here in Toronto.
Is there a question?
Yes, there is a question. I promise I'm getting there.
All right.
I wrote it down.
Just because there's others waiting. Thank you.
course.
Yeah.
I was just asking for you to comment on the pervasiveness of the idea of how this spillover is coming, this idea of like, well, we're at least not the US and constantly comparing to the US. How is this impacting the way people are learning about Canadian history, politics, and current events from within Canada when so much of the words that are being used are coming from the US and the laws are coming from the US?
Well, the laws aren't coming from the U.S.
No, but the laws that people tend to talk about, at least from what I'm hearing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I give a quick response?
Sure.
I mean, yeah, and I don't mean to be. I appreciate there's a long history of Canada defining itself as not American. That that is part of the cultural imaginary, and so we can have a much longer discussion about that. But and again, appreciate where I'm coming from. Feeling uncomfortable because you're being told, well, aren't you happy to be here, is different than my experience whenever I go back being told you don't belong here.
You don't belong, oh no, American.
Or you shouldn't be here. Because that's the immigrant experience in the United States. It has always been that, and it's certainly that way now. And so, it's important to sort of balance it, and we live in a world in which national identities matter because our education systems are going to be very different. I arrived in the United States, didn't give a hoot about Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and every single colleague in political theory, which is my field, teaches Democracy in America. I had never read it because I grew up in Canada, and why would I read Democracy in America at that time in Canada when we were being educated, right? So there are very different types of education that present very different types of histories, right?
Great. Malinda, go ahead.
Quickly. So most of us probably on the podium have experience of being educated in the United States. And there's a long history of movement back and forth across the border, of students coming here and students going down, and similarly with professors, postdocs, and so on. And so in a way, this moment has chilled that, including all kinds of researchers, especially in STEM, who are having collaborative relations with the United States. And so that's one kind of thing. The political environment is chilling those kinds of relations. But actually, how Canadian identity, so elbows up and all of that kind of the new nationalism, yes, the Trump administration, it is accurate to say, has increased Canadian nationalism in ways I have not seen in decades. So the threat, external threat, and I think it felt existential when one is referring to Canada as the 51st state. Canadians refer to the United States as their neighbors. And yes, you're right, there's a level of smugness about we are nicer, we are maple syrup, unlike, and so, but you have to just take that with a grain of salt, because we joke about it, it's part of our collective humor as well. But I actually do think there's something deeper and more serious going on here about the harm to the relationship. Best friends, neighbors, longest border, all of that stuff. I think I've never seen anything like this, and I think it is a cause for worry and concern.
Thank you so much for the question. We'll just go over here.
The freedom of food and the cosmos of gender sensitivity are 44 governing bodies in the Canadian Honored House of Labor make up for our privileges and duties and the leaning tower of responsibility. Hope and ambition are virtues, their sustenance and appetite. The viability of the universities are dependent upon research and the union government of the day and its revelations and accelerated discoveries. Universities have gone through an epoch where the database has gone through an algorithm.
Sorry to interrupt, but did you have a question?
I'm enjoying this. I want, just keep on going.
Okay, there's no
Depends how long
Bible
it
in
is.
heaven. The question is coming up. Institutions are man-made mountains. Our Ivy League towers have fluxed through the palace of fidelity, where its database has been reproduced in its product of velocity of the medium. There are outliers where there is the odd exception. One blackberry or blueberry out of 99 Juneberries. In our union circles of the late 70s and 80s, the bantering was no justice, no peace. Scholar for dollar, solitude surfaces.
And here comes the
The
question.
hand of the clock awaits. What was your discovery?
Of an amazing orator.
Thank you.
I guess we end there.
Any comment?
Thank you for sharing.
Okay, great.
But
We're moving right over here, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's really important to speak about the role of the university. I teach history at Glendon College, part of York University. It's a bilingual college. It was formed in the 1970s as a way to train Canadians who could travel all over the world and speak French and English. And it was a liberal arts college. And as you've mentioned, there is such a crisis for the humanities especially. So I know it's usually social science and humanities, but it's extremely difficult as a practicing historian to get students into my class. So I think you're absolutely right that it's partially the parents, but this is a rare opportunity to be able to speak to Canadians. And I just want to tell you, history is very important, not just so that we understand why it's not a great idea to just bomb a place and try to remove the leader. I'm a Latin American historian. It's really disturbing to see what's being done in Venezuela and what might be done shortly in Cuba. But it's also the skills that you develop studying history are very relevant for today. We're kind of the original fact checkers. So we do look at who said it, why did they say it, where did they say it, what words are they using to convince you, how does this source stand in relation to 5 other sources. These are the skills that our students need, that our people need to be good citizens, to understand what's really happening, to be good journalists, to be good politicians. Many politicians have history degrees, but history programs have been closed down everywhere, including at Glendon. There's history at Kiel campus, thank God, and please send your students. Send your students to history programs.
Thank
I
you.
do have a question,
Okay, a quick
which is about AI.
Please.
So I do feel like this has thrown a huge extra hoop at us, and I was curious what your thoughts are on what our roles are as professors now that we manage AI with the students. Thank you.
Who would like to take that first? Davide, go for it.
So, thank you for that question. It's a very strange thing that the humanities, other than a few pockets of the humanities and social sciences, have done a very, very bad job with engaging with the history of technology in relationship to the history of society and so on and so forth. You don't get that many courses other than in a few select spaces, and I think it's really important. We are experiencing a moment, I compare it to sometimes laughingly, like now that I can see you, we're generationally adjacent. And so, you know, for us it was, is it going to be beta or is it going to be VHS? And we don't know. And so we buy both beta and VHS, and then it turns out that it's VHS, and then it turns out that it's Blockbuster, and then is it Blockbuster or Netflix? And it turns out that it's Netflix, and so on and so forth. We're in this moment that we actually don't know what this technology is and what it does. We know what it's being sold to us as, right? And so I think it's really important, and it's part of the very, very hard work that we have to do as professors that also speaks to this question of knowledge under siege, to actually engage the technology and figure out its place in the classroom and with the students and in the education system that we have. Because we can't police it and we can't turn our backs on it.
It's a work in progress.
It is. Very
Final
much so.
question right here.
I just have a question about what I see as two existential threats to the universities. The one you touched on already was that technology is moving so quickly, not just technology, but knowledge in general. You know, for years we had the Big Bang Theory. In the last year, I think we've had about 4 very different theories succeed that, one after the other, and now we think maybe we're actually just living in a huge black hole. I'm not sure.
It feels like that sometimes.
That was the one threat I see. I'd like to just mention both threats, and you can respond to either one. But the one threat is that knowledge is advancing so quickly, it must be very hard to have course content which is actually even relevant to what students experience by the time they graduate. And are the universities nimble enough to survive and stay relevant in the face of that? And the second is that we're in a place now where what we think is, we don't even know anymore what knowledge is. People are bombarded with knowledge which is not knowledge every day. And there's no truthiness to any of the things that we read. And after a while, we begin to doubt everything. And what is the role of the universities as we go through this space where knowledge is no longer knowledge, apparently? It's
So are you, go ahead, Randy.
Sure.
Are universities nimble to react to all this?
But they shouldn't be. Slow things down, you know? I'm always skeptical of the term relevance. I think if we try to be relevant, we're chasing the wrong thing. I teach St. Augustine's Confessions, and I make the case that this book is more relevant to students than 99% of what else they're going to read at other books they'll read at university. Why? It's about a young person whose parents are pressuring him to do something with his life that he doesn't want to do. He's from North Africa, he's moved to the big city, he doesn't know anyone, and he's trying to figure out what he's supposed to do with his time and his talents. That is permanently relevant. Universities should be focused on what is permanently relevant to human experience and to the world at large.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I want to just take a moment to thank our panelists for being here, for coming all this way. Randy, Malinda, Davide, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Nahlah.
A huge thank you to the University of Regina and to Marc Spooner again for making tonight possible. Thank you. And for those who are interested, Marc will be outside to sign books if you're interested in buying one of those books. Thank you to TIFA, Hani, and all the crew who are here from the university as well. Thank you all very much for all your help. Have a very safe evening, and thanks for being here tonight.